Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina, Book 4, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Everyone took part in the conversation except Kitty and Levin. At first, when they were talking of the influence that one people has on another, there rose to Levin's mind what he had to say on the subject. But these ideas, once of such importance in his eyes, seemed to come into his brain as in a dream, and had now not the slightest interest for him. It even struck him as strange that they should be so eager to talk of what was of no use to anyone. Kitty, too, should, one would have supposed, have been interested in what they were saying of the rights and education of women. How often she had mused on the subject, thinking of her friend abroad, Varenka, of her painful state of dependence. How often she had wondered about herself and what would become of her if she did not marry, and how often she had argued with her sister about it. But it did not interest her at all. She and Levin had a conversation of their own, yet not a conversation, but some sort of mysterious communication, which brought them every moment nearer, and stirred in both a sense of glad terror before the unknown into which they were both entering. At first Levin, in answer to Kitty's question how he could have seen her last year in the carriage, told her how he had been coming home from the mowing along the high-road and had met her. "It was very, very early in the morning. You were probably only just awake. Your mother was asleep in the corner. It was an exquisite morning. I was walking along wondering who it could be in a four-in-hand. It was a splendid set of 4 horses with bells, and in a second you flashed by, and I saw you at the window. You were sitting like this, holding the strings of your cap in both hands, and thinking awfully deeply about something," he said, smiling. "How I should like to know what you were thinking about then. Something important?" "Wasn't I dreadfully untidy?" she wondered. But seeing the smile of ecstasy these reminiscences called up, she felt that the impression she had made had been very good. She blushed and laughed with delight. "Really, I don't remember." "How nicely Turovtsin laughs," said Levin, admiring his moist eyes and shaking chest. "Have you known him long?" asked Kitty. "Oh, everyone knows him." "And I see you think he's a horrid man?" "Not horrid, but nothing in him." "Oh, you're wrong, and you must give up thinking so directly," said Kitty. "I used to have a very poor opinion of him too, but he's awfully nice and a wonderfully good-hearted man. He has a heart of gold." "How could you find out what sort of heart he has?" "We are great friends. I know him very well. Last winter, soon after you came to see us," she said, with a guilty and at the same time confiding smile, "all Dolly's children had scarlet fever, and he happened to come and see her. And only fancy," she said in a whisper, "he felt so sorry for her that he stayed and began to help look after the children. Yes, and for 3 weeks he stopped with them and looked after the children like a nurse. I am telling Konstantin Dmitrievitch about Turovtsin in the scarlet fever," she said, bending over to her sister. "Yes, it was wonderful, noble," said Dolly, glancing towards Turovtsin, who had become aware that they were talking of him, and smiling gently to him. Levin glanced once more at Turovtsin, and wondered how it was that he had not realized all this man's goodness before. I'm sorry, and I'll never think ill of people again," he said gaily, genuinely expressing what he felt at the moment. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina, Book 4, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Connected with the conversation that had sprung up on the rights of women there were certain questions as to the inequality of rights in marriage, improper to discuss before the ladies. Pestov had several times during dinner touched upon these questions, but Sergey Ivanovitch and Stepan Arkadyevitch carefully drew him off them. When they rose from the table and the ladies had gone out, Pestov did not follow them, but addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch, he began to expound the chief ground of inequality. The inequality in marriage, in his opinion, lay in the fact that the infidelity of the wife and the infidelity of the husband are punished unequally, both by the law and by public opinion. Stepan Arkadyevitch went hurriedly up to Alexey Alexandrovitch and offered him a cigar. "No, I don't smoke," Alexey Alexandrovitch answered calmly, and as though purposely wishing to show that he was not afraid of the subject, he turned to Pestsov with a chilly smile. "I imagine that such a view has a foundation in the very nature of things," he said, and would have gone on to the drawing-room. But at this point Turovtsin broke suddenly and unexpectedly into the conversation, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch. "You heard perhaps about Pryatchnikov?" asked Turovtsin, warmed up by the champagne he had drunk and long waiting for an opportunity to break the silence that had weighed on him. "Vasya Pryatchnikov," he said, with a good-natured smile on his damp red lips, addressing himself principally to the most important guest, Alexey Alexandrovitch. "They told me today he fought a duel with Kvitsky at Tver and has killed him." Just as it always seems that one bruises oneself on a sore place, so Stepan Arkadyevitch felt now that the conversation would by ill luck fall every moment on Alexey Alexandrovitch's sore spot. He would again have got his brother-in-law away, but Alexey Alexandrovitch himself inquired with curiosity. "What did Pryatchnikov fight about?" "His wife. Acted like a man, he did. Called him out and shot him." "Ah," said Alexey Alexandrovitch indifferently, and lifting his eyebrows, he went into the drawing-room. "How glad I am you have come," Dolly said with a frightened smile, meeting him in the outer drawing-room. "I must talk to you. Let's sit here." Alexey Alexandrovitch, with the same expression of indifference, given him by his lifted eyebrows, sat down beside Darya Alexandrovna and smiled affectedly. "It's fortunate," said he, "especially as I was meaning to ask you to excuse me, and to be taking leave. I have to start tomorrow." Darya Alexandrovna was firmly convinced of Anna's innocence, and she felt herself growing pale and her lips quivering with anger at this frigid, unfeeling man, who was so calmly intending to ruin her innocent friend. "Alexey Alexandrovitch," she said with desperate resolution, looking him in the face, "I asked you about Anna. You made me no answer. How is she?" "She is, I believe, quite well, Darya Alexandrovna," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, not looking at her. "Alexey Alexandrovitch, forgive me. I have no right. But I love Anna as a sister, and esteem her. I beg, I beseech you to tell me what is wrong between you. What fault do you find with her?" Alexey Alexandrovitch frowned, and almost closing his eyes, dropped his head. "I presume that your husband has told you the grounds on which I consider it necessary to change my attitude to Anna Arkadyevna," he said, not looking her in the face, but eyeing with displeasure Shtcherbatsky, who was walking across the drawing-room. "I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I can't believe it," Dolly said, clasping her bony hands before her with a vigorous gesture. She rose quickly and laid her hand on Alexey Alexandrovitch's sleeve. "We shall be disturbed here. Come this way, please." Dolly's agitation had an effect on Alexey Alexandrovitch. He got up and submissively followed her to the schoolroom. They sat down to a table covered with an oilcloth cut in slits by penknives. I don't believe it," Dolly said, trying to catch his glance that avoided her. "One cannot disbelieve facts, Darya Alexandrovna," he said, with an emphasis on the word facts. "But what has she done?" said Darya Alexandrovna. "What precisely has she done?" "She has forsaken her duty and deceived her husband. That's what she has done," said he. "No, no, it can't be. No, for God's sake, you are mistaken," said Dolly, putting her hands to her temples and closing her eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled coldly, with his lips alone, meaning to signify to her and to himself the firmness of his conviction. But this warm defense, though it could not shake him, reopened his wound. He began to speak with greater heat. "It is extremely difficult to be mistaken when a wife herself informs her husband of the fact. Informs him that 8 years of her life, and a son, all that's a mistake, and that she wants to begin life again," he said angrily, with a snort. "Anna and sin! I cannot connect them. I cannot believe it." "Darya Alexandrovna," he said, now looking straight into Dolly's kindly, troubled face, and feeling that his tongue was being loosened in spite of himself. "I would give a great deal for doubt to still be possible. When I doubted I was miserable, but it was better than now. When I doubted I had hope, but now there is no hope, and still I doubt of everything. I am in such doubt of everything that I even hate my son, and sometimes do not believe he is my son. I am very unhappy." He had no need to say that. Darya Alexandrovna had seen that as soon as he glanced into her face, and she felt sorry for him, and her faith in the innocence of her friend began to totter. "Oh, this is awful, awful! But can it be true that you are resolved on a divorce?" "I am resolved on extreme measures. There is nothing else for me to do." "Nothing else to do? Nothing else to do?" she replied with tears in her eyes. "Oh no, don't say nothing else to do," she said. "What is horrible in trouble of this kind is that one cannot, as in any other, in loss, in death, bear one's trouble in peace, but that one must act," said he, as though guessing her thoughts. "One must get out of the humiliating position in which one is placed. One cannot live à trois." "I understand, I quite understand that," said Dolly, and her head sank. She was silent for a little, thinking of herself, of her own grief in her family, and all at once, with an impulsive movement, she raised her head and clasped her hands with an imploring gesture. "But wait a little. You are a Christian. Think of her. What will become of her, if you cast her off?" "I have thought, Darya Alexandrovna. I have thought a great deal," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. His face turned red in patches, and his dim eyes looked straight before him. Darya Alexandrovna at that moment pitied him with all her heart. "That was what I did indeed when she herself made known to me my humiliation. I left everything as of old. I gave her a chance to reform. I tried to save her. And with what result? She would not regard the slightest request. That she should observe decorum," he said, getting heated. "One may save anyone who does not want to be ruined. But if the whole nature is so corrupt, so depraved, that ruin itself seems to be her salvation, what's to be done?" "Anything, only not divorce," answered Darya Alexandrovna. "But what is anything?" "No, it is awful. She will be no one's wife. She will be lost." "What can I do?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch, raising his shoulders and his eyebrows. The recollection of his wife's last act had so incensed him that he had become frigid, as at the beginning of the conversation. "I am very grateful for your sympathy, but I must be going," he said, getting up. "No, wait a minute. You must not ruin her. Wait a little. I will tell you about myself. I was married, and my husband deceived me. In anger and jealousy I would have thrown up everything. I would myself. But I came to myself again. And who did it? Anna saved me. And here I am living on. The children are growing up. My husband has come back to his family and feels his fault, is growing purer, better, and I live on. I have forgiven it, and you ought to forgive." Alexey Alexandrovitch heard her, but her words had no effect on him now. All the hatred of that day when he had resolved on a divorce had sprung up again in his soul. He shook himself and said in a shrill, loud voice, "Forgive I cannot, and I do not wish to, and I regard it as wrong. I have done everything for this woman, and she has trodden it all in the mud to which she is akin. I am not a spiteful man. I have never hated anyone, but I hate her with my whole soul, and I cannot even forgive her, because I hate her too much for all the wrong she has done me," he said, with tones of hatred in his voice. "Love those that hate you," Darya Alexandrovna whispered timorously. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled contemptuously. That he knew long ago, but it could not be applied to his case. "Love those that hate you, but to love those one hates is impossible. Forgive me for having troubled you. Everyone has enough to bear in his own grief." And regaining his self-possession, Alexey Alexandrovitch quietly took leave and went away. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina, Book 4, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. When they rose from table, Levin would have liked to follow Kitty into the drawing-room, but he was afraid she might dislike this, as too obviously paying her attention. He remained in the little ring of men, taking part in the general conversation, and without looking at Kitty, he was aware of her movements, her looks, and the place where she was in the drawing-room. He did at once, and without the smallest effort, keep the promise he had made her, always to think well of all men, and to like everyone always. The conversation fell on the village commune, in which Pestov saw a sort of special principle, called by him the choral principle. Levin did not agree with Pestov, nor with his brother, who had a special attitude of his own, both admitting and not admitting the significance of the Russian commune. But he talked to them, simply trying to reconcile and soften their differences. He was not in the least interested in what he said himself, and even less so in what they said. All he wanted was that they and everyone should be happy and contented. He knew now the one thing of importance, and that one thing was at first there, in the drawing-room, and then began moving across, and came to a standstill at the door. Without turning round he felt the eyes fixed on him, and the smile, and he could not help turning round. She was standing in the doorway with Shtcherbatsky, looking at him. "I thought you were going towards the piano," he said, going up to her. "That's something I miss in the country. Music." "No, we only came to fetch you and thank you," she said, rewarding him with a smile that was like a gift, "for coming. What do they want to argue for? No one ever convinces anyone, you know." "Yes, that's true," said Levin. "It generally happens that one argues warmly simply because one can't make out what one's opponent wants to prove." Levin had often noticed in discussion between the most intelligent people that after enormous efforts, and an enormous expenditure of logical subtleties and words, the disputants finally arrived at being aware that what they had so long been struggling to prove to one another had long ago, from the beginning of the argument, been known to both, but that they liked different things, and would not define what they liked for fear of its being attacked. He had often had the experience of suddenly in a discussion grasping what it was his opponent liked, and at once liking it too, and immediately he found himself agreeing, and then all arguments fell away as useless. Sometimes, too, he had experienced the opposite, expressing at last what he liked himself, which he was devising arguments to defend, and, chancing to express it well and genuinely, he had found his opponent at once agreeing and ceasing to dispute his position. He tried to say this. She knitted her brow, trying to understand, but directly he began to illustrate his meaning, she understood at once. "I know. One must find out what he is arguing for, what is precious to him. Then one can—" She had completely guessed and expressed his badly expressed idea. Levin smiled joyfully. He was struck by this transition from the confused, verbose discussion with Pestov and his brother to this laconic, clear, almost wordless communication of the most complex ideas. Shtcherbatsky moved away from them, and Kitty, going up to a card table, sat down and, taking up the chalk, began drawing diverging circles over the new green cloth. They began again on the subject that had been started at dinner, the liberty and occupations of women. Levin was of the opinion of Darya Alexandrovna that a girl who did not marry should find a woman's duties in a family. He supported this view by the fact that no family can get on without women to help, that in every family, poor or rich, there are and must be nurses, either relations or hired. "No," said Kitty, blushing, but looking at him all the more boldly with her truthful eyes. "A girl may be so circumstanced that she cannot live in the family without humiliation, while she herself—" At the hint he understood her. "Oh, yes," he said. "Yes, yes, yes. You're right, you're right." And he saw all that Pestov had been maintaining at dinner of the liberty of women, simply from getting a glimpse of the terror of an old maid's existence, and its humiliation in Kitty's heart. And loving her, he felt that terror and humiliation, and at once gave up his arguments. A silence followed. She was still drawing with the chalk on the table. Her eyes were shining with a soft light. Under the influence of her mood he felt in all his being a continually growing tension of happiness. "Ah, I've scribbled all over the table," she said, and, laying down the chalk, she made a movement as though to get up. "What, shall I be left alone, without her?" he thought with horror, and he took up the chalk. "Wait a minute," he said, sitting down to the table. "I've long wanted to ask you one thing." He looked straight into her caressing though frightened eyes. "Please, ask it." "Here," he said, and he wrote the initial letters W, Y, T, M, I, C, N, B, D, T, M, N, O, T. These letters meant, "When you told me it could never be, did that mean never or then?" There seemed no likelihood that she could make out this complicated sentence, but he looked at her as though his life depended on her understanding the words. She glanced at him seriously, then leaned her puckered brow on her hands and began to read. Once or twice she stole a look at him, as though asking, "Is this what I think?" "I understand," she said, flushing a little. "What is this word?" he said, pointing to the N that stood for never. "It means never," she said, "but that's not true." He quickly rubbed out what he had written, gave her the chalk and stood up. She wrote T-I-C-N-A-D. Dolly was completely comforted in the depression caused by her conversation with Alexey Alexandrovitch when she caught sight of the two figures, Kitty with the chalk in her hand, with a shy and a happy smile looking upwards at Levin, and his handsome figure bending over the table with glowing eyes fastened 1 minute on the table and the next on her. He was suddenly radiant. He had understood. It meant, "Then I could not answer differently." He glanced at her questioningly, timidly. "Only then?" "Yes," her smile answered. "And now?" he asked. "Well, read this. I'll tell you what I should like so much." She wrote the initial letters I, Y, C, F, A, F, W, H. This meant, "If you could forget and forgive what happened." He snatched the chalk with nervous, trembling fingers, and breaking it, wrote the initial letters of the following phrase: "I have nothing to forget and to forgive. I have never ceased to love you." She glanced at him with a smile that did not waver. "I understand," she said in a whisper. He sat down and wrote a long phrase. She understood it all, and without asking him, "Is it this?" took the chalk and at once answered. For a long while he could not understand what she had written, and often looked into her eyes. He was stupefied with happiness. He could not supply the words she had meant, but in her charming eyes, beaming with happiness, he saw all he needed to know. And he wrote 3 letters, but he had hardly finished writing when she read them over her arm, and herself finished, and wrote the answer, "Yes." "You're playing secrétaire," said the old prince. "But we must really be getting along, if you want to be in time at the theatre." Levin got up and escorted Kitty to the door. In their conversation everything had been said. It had been said that she loved him, and that she would tell her father and mother that he would come tomorrow morning. Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina, Book 4, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. When Kitty had gone and Levin was left alone, he felt such uneasiness without her, and such an impatient longing to get as quickly as possible, to tomorrow morning, when he would see her again and be plighted to her forever, that he felt afraid, as though of death, of those 14 hours that he had to get through without her. It was essential for him to be with someone to talk to, so as not to be left alone, to kill time. Stepan Arkadyevitch would have been the companion most congenial to him, but he was going out, he said, to a soirée. in reality to the ballet. Levin only had time to tell him he was happy, and that he loved him, and would never, never forget what he had done for him. The eyes and the smile of Stepan Arkadyevitch showed Levin that he comprehended that feeling fittingly. "Oh, so it's not time to die yet?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, pressing Levin's hand with emotion. "No," said Levin. Darya Alexandrovna, too, as she said good-bye to him, gave him a sort of congratulation, saying, "How glad I am you have met Kitty again. One must value old friends." Levin did not like these words of Darya Alexandrovna's. She could not understand how lofty and beyond her it all was, and she ought not to have dared to allude to it. Levin said good-bye to them, but, not to be left alone, he attached himself to his brother. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to a meeting." "Well, I'll come with you. May I?" "What for?" "Yes, come along," said Sergey Ivanovitch, smiling. "What is the matter with you today?" "With me? Happiness is the matter with me," said Levin, letting down the window of the carriage they were driving in. "You don't mind? It's so stifling. It's happiness is the matter with me. Why is it you have never married?" Sergey Ivanovitch smiled. "I am very glad. She seems a nice Sergey Ivanovitch was beginning. "Don't say it! Don't say it!" shouted Levin, clutching at the collar of his fur coat with both hands and muffling him up in it. "She's a nice girl" were such simple, humble words, so out of harmony with his feeling. Sergey Ivanovitch laughed outright, a merry laugh, which was rare with him. "Well, anyway, I may say that I'm very glad of it." "That you may do tomorrow. Tomorrow and nothing more. Nothing, nothing. Silence!" said Levin, and muffling him once more in his fur coat, he added, "I do like you so. Well, is it possible for me to be present at the meeting?" "Of course it is." "What is your discussion about today?" asked Levin, never ceasing smiling. They arrived at the meeting. Levin heard the secretary hesitatingly read the minutes, which he obviously did not himself understand, but Levin saw from his secretary's face what a good, nice, kind-hearted person he was. This was evident from his confusion and embarrassment in reading the minutes. Then the discussion began. They were disputing about the misappropriation of certain sums and the laying of certain pipes, and Sergey Ivanovitch was very cutting to two members, and said something at great length with an air of triumph, and another member, scribbling something on a bit of paper, began timidly at first, but afterwards answered him very viciously and delightfully. And then Sviazhsky, he was there too, said something too, very handsomely and nobly. Levin listened to them and saw clearly that these missing sums and these pipes were not anything real, and that they were not at all angry, but were all the nicest, kindest people, and everything was as happy and charming as possible among them. They did no harm to anyone, and were all enjoying it. What struck Levin was that he could see through them all today, and from little, almost imperceptible signs knew the soul of each, and saw distinctly that they were all good at heart. And Levin himself in particular they were all extremely fond of that day. That was evident from the way they spoke to him, from the friendly, affectionate way even those he did not know looked at him. "Well, did you like it?" Sergey Ivanovitch asked him. "Very much. I never supposed it was so interesting. Capital! Splendid!" Sviazhsky went up to Levin and invited him to come round to tea with him. Levin was utterly at a loss to comprehend or recall what it was he had disliked in Sviazhsky, what he had failed to find in him. He was a clever and wonderfully good-hearted man. "Most delighted," he said, and asked after his wife and sister-in-law. And from a queer association of ideas, because in his imagination the idea of Sviazhsky's sister-in-law was connected with marriage, it occurred to him that there was no one to whom he could more suitably speak of his happiness, and he was very glad to go and see them. Sviazhsky questioned him about his improvements on his estate, presupposing, as he always did, that there was no possibility of doing anything not already done in Europe. And now this did not in the least annoy Levin. On the contrary, he felt that Sviazhsky was right, that the whole business was of little value, and he saw the wonderful softness and consideration with which Sviazhsky avoided fully expressing his correct view. The ladies of the Sviazhsky household were particularly delightful. It seemed to Levin that they knew all about it already and sympathized with him, saying nothing merely from delicacy. He stayed with them 1 hour, 2, 3, talking all sorts of subjects but the one thing that filled his heart, and did not observe that he was boring them dreadfully, and that it was long past their bedtime. Sviazhsky went with him into the hall, yawning and wondering at the strange humor his friend was in. It was past 1 o'clock. Levin went back to his hotel, and was dismayed at the thought that all alone now with his impatience he had 10 hours still left to get through. The servant, whose turn it was to be up all night, lighted his candles, and would have gone away, but Levin stopped him. This servant, Yegor, whom Levin had noticed before, struck him as a very intelligent, excellent, and above all, good-hearted man. "Why, Yegor, it's hard work not sleeping, isn't it?" "One's got to put up with it. It's part of our work, you see. In a gentleman's house it's easier, but then here one makes more." It appeared that Yegor had a family, 3 boys and a daughter, a sempstress whom he wanted to marry to a cashier in a saddler's shop. Levin, on hearing this, informed Yegor that, in his opinion, in marriage the great thing was love, and that with love one would always be happy, for happiness rests only on oneself. Yegor listened attentively, and obviously quite took in Levin's idea, but by way of assent to it he enunciated, greatly to Levin's surprise, the observation that when he had lived with good masters he had always been satisfied with his masters, and now was perfectly satisfied with his employer, though he was a Frenchman. "Wonderfully good-hearted fellow," thought Levin. "Well, but you yourself, Yegor, when you got married, did you love your wife?" "Aye, and why not?" responded Yegor. And Levin saw that Yegor too was in an excited state and intending to express all his most heartfelt emotions. "My life too has been a wonderful one. From a child up," he was beginning with flashing eyes, apparently catching Levin's enthusiasm, just as people catch yawning. But at that moment a ring was heard. Yegor departed, and Levin was left alone. He had eaten scarcely anything at dinner, had refused tea and supper at Sviazhsky's, but he was incapable of thinking of supper. He had not slept the previous night, but was incapable of thinking of sleep either. His room was cold, but he was oppressed by heat. He opened both the movable panes in his window and sat down to the table opposite the panes. Over the snow-covered roofs could be seen a decorated cross with chains, and above it the rising triangle of Charles Wain with the yellowish light of Capella. He gazed at the cross, then at the stars, drank in the fresh freezing air that flowed evenly into the room, and followed as though in a dream the images and memories that rose in his imagination. At 4 o'clock he heard steps in the passage and peeped out at the door. It was the gambler, Myaskin, whom he knew was coming from the club. He walked gloomily, frowning and coughing. "Poor unlucky fellow," thought Levin, and tears came into his eyes from love and pity for this man. He would have talked with him and tried to comfort him, but remembering that he had nothing but his shirt on, he changed his mind and sat down again at the open pane to bathe in the cold air and gaze at the exquisite lines of the cross, silent but full of meaning for him, and the mounting lurid yellow star. At 7 o'clock there was a noise of people polishing the floors, and bells ringing in some servants' department, and Levin felt that he was beginning to get frozen. He closed the pane, washed, dressed, and went out into the street. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina, Book 4, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The streets were still empty. Levin went to the house of the Shtcherbatskys. The visitors' doors were closed and everything was asleep. He walked back, went into his room again, and asked for coffee. The day servant, not Yegor this time, brought it to him. Levin would have entered into conversation with him, but a bell rang for the servant and he went out. Levin tried to drink coffee and put some roll in his mouth, but his mouth was quite at a loss what to do with the roll. Levin, rejecting the roll, put on his coat and went out again for a walk. It was 9 o'clock when he reached the Shtcherbatskys' steps the second time. In the house they were only just up, and the cook came out to go marketing. He had to go through at least 2 hours more. All that night and morning Levin lived perfectly unconsciously, and felt perfectly lifted out of the conditions of material life. He had eaten nothing for a whole day. He had not slept for 2 nights. He had spent several hours undressed in the frozen air, and felt not simply fresher and stronger than ever, but felt utterly independent of his body. He moved without muscular effort, and felt as if he could do anything. He was convinced he could fly upwards, or lift the corner of the house if need be. He spent the remainder of the time in the street, incessantly looking at his watch and gazing about him. And what he saw then, he never saw again after. The children especially going to school, the bluish doves flying down from the roofs to the pavement, and the little loaves covered with flour, thrust out by an unseen hand, touched him. Those loaves, those doves, and those 2 boys were not earthly creatures. It all happened at the same time. A boy ran towards a dove and glanced smiling at Levin. The dove with a whir of her wings darted away, flashing in the sun, amid grains of snow that quivered in the air, while from a little window there came a smell of freshly baked bread, and the loaves were put out. All of this together was so extraordinarily nice that Levin laughed and cried with delight. Going a long way round to Gazetsny Place and Kislovka, he went back again to the hotel, and putting his watch before him, he sat down to wait for 12 o'clock. In the next room they were talking about some sort of machines, and swindling, and coughing their morning coughs. They did not realize that the hand was near 12. The hand reached it. Levin went out onto the steps. The sledge drivers clearly knew all about it. They crowded round Levin with happy faces, quarreling among themselves and offering their services. Trying not to offend the other sledge drivers, and promising to drive with them too, Levin took one and told him to drive to the Shtcherbatskys'. The sledge driver was splendid in a white shirt collar sticking out over his overcoat and into his strong, full-bodied red neck. The sledge was high and comfortable, and altogether such a one as Levin had never drove in after, and the horse was a good one, and tried to gallop, but didn't seem to move. The driver knew the Shtcherbatskys' house, and drew up at the entrance with a curve of his arm and a ho, especially indicative of respect for his fare. The Shtcherbatskys' hall porter certainly knew all about it. This was evident from the smile in his eyes and the way he said, "Well, it's a long time since you've been to see us, Konstantin Dmitrievitch." Not only he knew all about it, but he was unmistakably delighted and making efforts to conceal his joy. Looking into his kindly old eyes, Levin realized even something new in his happiness. "Are they up? Pray walk in. Leave it here," said he, smiling as Levin would have come back to take his hat. That meant something. "To whom shall I announce your honor?" asked the footman. The footman, though a young man, and one of the new school of footmen, a dandy, was a very kind-hearted, good fellow, and he too knew all about it. "The princess, the prince, the young princess," said Levin. The first person he saw was Mademoiselle Linon. She walked across the room, and her ringlets and her face were beaming. He had only just spoken to her, when suddenly he heard the rustle of a skirt at the door, and Mademoiselle Linon vanished from Levin's eyes, and a joyful terror came over him at the nervousness of his happiness. Mademoiselle Linon was in great haste, and leaving him, went out at the other door. Directly she had gone out, swift, light steps sounded on the parquet, and his bliss, his life, himself, what was best in himself, what he had so long sought and longed for, was quickly, so quickly approaching him. She did not walk, but seemed, by some unseen force, to float to him. He saw nothing but her clear, truthful eyes, frightened by the same bliss of love that flooded his heart. Those eyes were shining nearer and nearer, blinding him with their light of love. She stopped still close to him. touching him. Her hands rose and dropped onto his shoulders. She had done all she could. She had run up to him and given herself up entirely, shy and happy. He put his arms round her and pressed his lips to her mouth that sought his kiss. She too had not slept all night, and had been expecting him all the morning. Her father and mother had consented without demur, and were happy in her happiness. She had been waiting for him. She wanted to be the first to tell him her happiness and his. She had got ready to see him alone, and had been delighted at the idea, and had been shy and ashamed, and did not know herself what she was doing. She had heard his steps and voice, and had waited at the door for Mademoiselle Linon to go. Mademoiselle Linon had gone away. Without thinking, without asking herself how and what, she had gone up to him, and did as she was doing. "Let us go to mamma," she said, taking him by the hand. For a long while he could say nothing, not so much because he was afraid of desecrating the loftiness of his emotion by a word, as that every time he tried to say something, instead of words he felt that tears of happiness were welling up. He took her hand and kissed it. "Can it be true?" he said at last in a choked voice. "I can't believe you love me, dear." She smiled at that dear, and at the timidity with which he gazed at her. "Yes," she said significantly, deliberately. "I am so happy." Now letting go his hands, she went into the drawing-room. The princess, seeing them, breathed quickly, and immediately began to cry, and then immediately began to laugh, and with a vigorous step Levin had not expected, ran up to him, and hugging his head, kissed him, wetting his cheeks with her tears. "So it is all settled. I am glad. Love her. I am glad. Kitty." "You have not been long settling things," said the old prince, trying to seem unmoved, but Levin noticed that his eyes were wet when he turned to him. "I've always wished for this," said the prince, taking Levin by the arm and drawing him towards himself, even when this little featherhead fancied— "Papa!" shrieked Kitty, and shut his mouth with her hands. "Well, I won't," he said. "I'm very, oh, what a fool I am!" He embraced Kitty, kissed her face, her hand, her face again, and made the sign of the cross over her. And there came over Levin a new feeling of love for this man, till then so little known to him, when he saw how slowly and tenderly Kitty kissed his muscular hand. Chapter 16